When you're sitting down to start writing a new story, a good story poorly told is better than a lame story told well. I chose to use the word lame because if you think of like a lame animal, you know, this is an animal that has a limp. If you have a story that could be a good story, but it has a weak point, it has a spot that has not been strategized enough and has not been made to operate in a balanced and stable manner. There are two phases of writing. There is the primary and the secondary. And when you're in the primary phase of writing, it's important to work on the story itself, not the choice of analogy, not the descriptiveness of characters, not the grammar, but to think about the scenarios involved in the story and the overall arc of the story and the guiding themes that will help you decide how to write the story. As we grow as writers, the writing process can start to feel very crowded. When we sit down to write, our brains can get very crowded because we're just trying to do too many things at once. We become too aware of all the different ways of looking at a work of writing, be it that you're looking at it in terms of its grammar or in terms of its descriptive powers, etc. When you're sitting down to write the story for the first time, it becomes important to decide ahead of time not to do all of the secondary work, but to work on the primary phase of writing a story. I'm not just saying this to make the task of writing easier and help you relax while you're writing and make writing a more enjoyable process, which it does do all those things, but that it will make you a better writer. In the secondary phase, clear thinking does lead to clear writing, and in the preliminary phase, flexible thinking leads to better writing. So it's very helpful to know which phase you're in. If you're in the preliminary phase, do everything you can to get yourself psyched out about being in that phase. If it helps you to work on scratch paper, if it helps you to feel like you can change any of it, that what you're working with is essentially disposable, that you're working on a rough sketch, any way that gives you the attitude that the material you're working with is not to be invested in the way of making it well told, but you're working with parts of a puzzle, and yes, if you write down what a certain character is like, that if you have the feeling that, oh, if for some reason you need to scrap that character, you can crumple up that piece of paper, throw that one away with no grief because you didn't spend as much time on it as you would later on when you're refining your work. But when you're in a preliminary phase, the better that you can develop this attitude where what you're working on is done quickly, is done recklessly, is done very unfinished, unrefined, disposable, interchangeable, then you create a writing atmosphere for yourself where you're able to work more flexibly, and you have more of an attitude where you can ask yourself, is this part of the story working? Can I change it? Can I switch it out? You will be a lot more willing to take out whole parts of a story and try different scenarios and try different characters. And if the more that you can work with your story in this way, where you're placing in and tearing out the foundation of your story without any grief, When we go to write, it is not necessarily the same activity. Yes, sometimes when we go to write, we're refining and we're adding in the detail and we're fleshing it out and we're decorating it and we're embellishing it and working on giving and designing it and giving it a distinct flavor and working on the poetry of how it's told. That's all done in a secondary phase. But the phase I'm talking about is where you have decided ahead of time not to, even though all of that is extremely enjoyable, you're putting it off. You're purposefully going to write poorly in a way that you can remain very nebulous about the story and be very willing to tear down parts of it and rebuild parts of it back up again. See, if we do too much of secondary phase work on the story, we cloud our ability to see the story just for what it is, the bare bones of that story. The later phases of writing are going to make it so you can't see the bare bones of the story as clearly. So it's a matter of focus. When you're just starting it out, you want to make it easier for yourself to be able to look right into the heart of your story and make changes there, because later on, if you start to embellish it, it's going to be hard to look past all of that hilarious dialogue and interesting locations involved in the story and all of that other kind of stuff to see, at essence, what the story is told on its most basic level. Artists of every kind, whatever form of art an artist does, there's always a point when they need to just spit it out, and writers are no different. As a writer, it's wonderful to work on refining the writing and all of that kind of other stuff, but it's equally as important to learn just to spit it out. What kind of writing, or what is this basic story? What am I talking about? Basically, imagine that you're on a camping trip and you're just going to tell the story at a campfire. You're going to tell it in such a way where it would take maybe 20 minutes to tell, and the reason the story will be interesting will be for what you can tell in those 20 minutes. It can be seen as the difference of being a good writer and a good storyteller. A good storyteller understands this sort of gameplay of stories, and it can be plot strategies, it can be through telling a story, developing a suspenseful environment, a number of things. It can be funny, but if you're working on being a good storyteller, you're looking at very different things than if you're looking at the different ways of writing well. Okay, so just imagine that you're part of a movie being made, and you're the writer and you're on set, and so there's one part where all of a sudden it occurs to you, no, I don't want the main character to go talk to these other characters. I thought of a much better idea. I can have the main character go back and do that. Oh, that would work so much better. What a great idea. What an interesting turn of events. It's going to make the whole story so much more interesting and a surprise. But, oh no, the actors are there. The CGI team has been working for the last 3 weeks on the CGI werewolves or whatever. And the sets have been built, and the soundtrack is being composed down the block in the soundproof rooms, and I can't change this part. It's locked in. Most of the work on a well-written story is done in the secondary phase, and yet a lot of the time what determines how high that story is going to fly, how inspired people will be by it, will be how much of the work is done in the preliminary phase. When you go to write, be very clear in your mind. Am I doing the preliminary work? Am I when I'm just starting a story out, or am I doing secondary work? So if you'll be doing preliminary work on a story for a week or so, change your workspace to psych yourself out about where you are in the story. Work on scrap paper or work on index cards, something that you know you're not going to keep. Just see how it sounds by verbally saying it. If storytelling is part of human nature, and if you can stand up in the room you're in and just try telling the story within a 20-minute period, and then you can see it, then all of a sudden you're looking at it at its most basic level, and you're going to be making the changes that will make it better on that most basic level. Working in this way brings joy into your writing in a number of different ways. First of all, if you consciously decide to work in this haphazard environment, then you can spend time in your writing getting loosened up and have a chance for all the creative juices to start flowing, and get inspired without any of that inspiration getting slowed down by refining what you already have. My desk is always cluttered with this, and all of this is just, it's the disposable work. It's the work where if I have an idea, I'm not going to hesitate to write it down because I'm refining anyway. I can write it on a scrap of piece of paper, and then I can kind of keep it there. And if it doesn't work out, no problem. I'm not doing anything that is the least bit permanent. Another joy that this way of working brings is this kind of gut level solidity that you feel about the stories that you work on. As you work on the preliminary in as loose a fashion as you possibly can, these stories that emerge, they're still at their simplest of forms, but then as you go forward and then go into the enjoyment of being the poet and being the decorator and the creator of the flavors of location and the interesting twists of character and the intricacies and all of that, you on your gut level you feel very confident about the story you're working on, because you know that on its most basic level it's a good story. Be clear on what focus you have on a story. Again, as we improve in writers, one thing that can happen is that our brains get really crowded because we're trying to have too many focuses. Always decide ahead of time, are you looking at it just purely for its grammar? Are you looking at it purely for scrutinizing all the be verbs? Are you looking at it purely for the naturalness of the dialogue? And just decide to have a focus, because that work of writing can look very different depending on the focus that you have. Another joy about working this way is that when you're working in the preliminary mode, it's all about flexibility of thinking. It's all about now, obviously, there a lot of creative thinking has gone into having a story in the first place to start working on. But as you start working on the story in a basic level, to every part that you look at, you're always at the freedom to say, well, are there other things that could happen that could make this outcome come about? Or are there different outcomes that could happen? You can ask yourself these questions, and because that is the only way that you're working with your story at that time. And flexibility of thinking is a really fun way to work, because it's about making discoveries. It's like, yes, I am working on a story I'm already really excited about working on. I think it's a good story. but then maybe I haven't even, the possibilities are sky high. There are things I just haven't thought about yet. You know, are there other things I can try? Are there other characters that I can bring in? In at least one session of writing, decide to utilize flexibility of thinking. It should actually not amount to that much writing. It's you're writing the rawest. It's all tell. You know, there's the phrase "show not tell." Well, in the preliminary work, it's tell. You just say that my protagonist runs around town causing disruption, instead of describing different actions that protagonist goes through. And say, today my focus is going to be on flexibility of thinking, and I'm going to go through it, and I'm going to ask myself, what are other things that could happen? What are other ways that the cause and effect chain can go along like a line of dominoes knocking each other over? Are there things I haven't thought about yet? And it is the best time to ask those questions, because it would take very little effort to switch and change essential parts of the story. But once again, if you're just starting a new story, it's much better to work on a good story poorly told than a lame story very well told. I hope that you enjoyed my video, and I make these so that I can always talk a little bit about my illustrated, narrated story that I'm working on, and I'm only working on one story that I'm going to put up as webisodes online, and it's with illustration and narrated. Some of it's animated. It's at solomation.com. The name of the story is Terrible Immunity. It's in episodes. It will be one story, whole and entire. Please take the time to go check it out. When I check out the stats and that it is getting views, that's the reason I love making more of these videos and these tutorials. So that is definitely the way to encourage me to make more of them. Also, please hit the like button, leave a comment, and subscribe. And I hope that your writing goes great, and have a good day. Be aware that every time we do art, we're in a feedback cycle. And this is a very powerful part about doing art. When we're writing, we get a certain feedback and so we're writing, and depending on what our focus is, we're deciding whether it's good or bad writing. And when we're judging our story on how good it is, if it were a story that was told in 20 minutes at the campfire, then we're in a feedback loop. We're working on our story, and we're trying to make it a real solid, good story in that form. And while we're working, we have the experience, we start to kind of brainstorm different ideas, and the different ideas we get as they fall into place, it's a feedback. We say, oh, that's a good idea. Oh yeah, that's kind of a good idea, except it needs some kind of working out. Yeah, this part is kind of working, but there's kind of something's not quite working. It's somehow lame. It's limping along. It's still a good story, but somehow it's limping along. And we can, in that feedback loop, we have decided to totally ignore all the other feedback, about whether you're using a certain word exactly to its definition or not, and all those other wonderful things that we can look at later. One thing you can do is you can go online and look up Moth, M-O-T-H, Moth. I get it as a podcast, and basically what it is that people just stand up and start telling stories. And this is wonderful. This is really, It's like I said, human nature. Storytelling is fundamental to human nature, but this sort of like really focusing on getting up, and you're not supposed to read a story to people. You're supposed to just tell it. And I really love this way of thinking, because if you can strengthen yourself as a writer on that level, it can't help but improve all the other different ways that we grow and improve as writers.